Well, that's one point. The other one that really grabbed my attention was the whole question of Saddam Hussein, Iraq, and weapons of mass destruction. I did not know, for example, and maybe I missed it, was it reported, or is this the first time, that Thabo Mbeki actually put together again the Project Coast team, the team that was headed by Dr. Death, Wouter Matisonn, for chemical and biological warfare. He actually put that team back together again to go to Iraq.
Yes.
Well, is this I haven't seen it reported anywhere.
There have been some oblique references, but what was not understood and what I was able to spell out was that this was the cause of the breakdown in the relationship between Thabo Mbeki as president of South Africa and Tony Blair as Prime Minister of Britain and a Labour Prime Minister. And of course, Thabo Mbeki had lived in England and had good ties with the Labour Party. So I think he was particularly shattered when he brought this material to Blair, and Blair dismissed him out of hand. And he'd got it from sending South Africans. You know, what I found in my book is that intelligence is often very, very bad, both British and South African and, of course, American. Surprisingly so when you really read the work of the experts who've really studied it. But in this case, South Africa's intelligence was dead right. British intelligence and American intelligence, as we now know, was dead wrong. And we could have, and Mbeki and Frank Chikane, who was working under him, Secretary of the Cabinet and Director General of the Presidency, they were really shocked and upset that here was an information that was sufficient to stop war was ignored, and they went to war.
Mandela had something to say about that as well, as I recall you mentioned in your book.
Yes,
about George Bush. I mean, he could pick up the phone and simply phone the president, couldn't he?
Well, yes, you know, Mandela, long into retirement until he became really not well, kept up relations with everybody, Bill Clinton, all these people, with the end of a phone. And he called President George W. Bush, and he was told, no, you can't talk to the president, you can talk to the National Security Advisor. And he was so upset, that was Condoleezza Rice, and he was so upset by this that he said something quite awkward in public and unusual for him. He said, George Bush doesn't know how to think. And it was because, you know, he had a deep-seated belief that the job of a politician is to fight for peace. That's why Mandela hated it when you talked about politicians in a derogatory manner. He said a politician is a really important person. He has a job as a political leader to bring peace. And of course, that's what he strove for in South Africa. And he was appalled that Bush and Blair were so ready to go to war.
Now, what you've done throughout this thing, you start, I mean, going right back, you have followed the newspaper history, which also I found very interesting. The fact that you found the first newspaper in South Africa was actually run by slave owners and has featured adverts for slave sales.
Yeah.
And the thread throughout is a journalistic thread. It's a personal journey through journalism, at the end of which you don't appear to be very pessimistic, given the level of, shall we say, pessimism that emerges from within the book in terms of what has happened post-1994. How do you feel now?
Look, democracy is better than apartheid. Let's not kid ourselves. People's lives got better immediately just by the removal of past laws, the establishment of a certain minimum level of water and electricity and so on. But under President Zuma, things are going very badly wrong. He's out of his depth. You know, he stayed in my house 25 years ago. We all had high hopes for him, but I don't think one can deny that under President Zuma, things are getting worse. And if you listen to him, his announcement after the students were protesting for lower fees, you just got the feeling of a man reading a text, not fully understanding the life of a student. These things are important. You know, when he was running for election, a lot of people said, just because he doesn't have an education doesn't mean he has a right to be president. Well, we all have a right to run for president in a democracy, but South Africa, the country, we have a right to the best possible president. And we don't have one now.
And what do you see for the future then? I mean, are you hopeful? Are you less hopeful than you were?
I think now, besides electoral power, South African civil society has to come together. If you think of the way the United Democratic Front did in the 80s, obviously there's not going to be a UDF just like that now. But I do think civil society has to make its voice heard. Fees Must Fall was an example of civil society coming together and making its voice heard. We have to do that as unions, trade unions, as industry, as business, as the professions, as academia. We have to speak out and organize.
So you've added now another level of debate and controversy to the many that you've got in this book, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Terry.